I could begin to tell this story by suggesting I enjoyed going for long walks at night. That perhaps would be a strange activity to take part in. The truth is that I would regularly walk home from a drinking session, having missed the last bus, busy with those final few shots. There were pubs nearer to my home than the one I chose to frequent, but they were either less pleasant venues or had me priced out. As a result, I made the Traveller's Rest my regular hideout, a traditional British pub in which every surface was sticky and one could still detect the odor of stale tobacco smoke, despite smoking in pubs having been banned back in 2006. However, to its merit, the Traveller's drinks were priced in a way more suited to my budget, and the pub featured a beer garden which overlooked the English Channel. In fact, due to the erosion of the local coastline, the pub was now positioned a little too close to the cliff edge for comfort, and staff were known to escort especially inebriated customers out to taxis to ensure they didn't wander the wrong way and end up mashed on the rocks below. June 1st was a typical Friday evening for me. Aside from the air temperature being a good 10 degrees warmer than usual, perhaps this was to be the start of the fabled British summer. Heat we are accustomed to, complain about, then miss terribly when it disappears a fortnight later. On this particular Friday, I had finished work in the nearest city, where I had been cooped up in a call center all day trying, unsuccessfully, to sell life insurance, and alighted the bus outside the Traveller's Rest. It was on the route which took me home, which was convenient, but the walk afterwards would be a good 40 minutes, or more, depending on how much I drank. And I drank a lot. This evening played out the same as so many before. I arrived at the bar around 6 p.m. I ordered 2 pints of strong scrumpy and 2 double whiskeys, and made my way out to the garden. I always ordered 2 of each drink, as the first one would go down too quickly, and I hated having to queue at the bar. Thankfully, my usual table was clear. I headed there out of habit, having soon learned that it was the only outside table which didn't wobble if you leaned on it. I gazed out across the stillness of the channel, knocking back the drinks, and making my way through almost an entire 20-pack of Super Kings. I lost track of time as I made my way back from the bar to my table with my 12th pint of scrumpy, and I just sat, rather heavily, back down when I heard the bell ring for time at the bar. I knew I had maybe 10 to 15 minutes to finish my drink before one of the bar staff would remind me I needed to go home. I also knew that the last bus home had left almost half an hour ago. It may have been the heat, which didn't mix well with such quantities of alcohol, but I felt exhausted. Drunkenly, I checked my wallet, dropping it in the process. But it contained no notes. I could feel a pile of loose coins in my right pocket, but upon inspection it did not appear to be enough to pay for a cab. I would have to walk again, and this time I didn't think I'd make it. The idea of sleeping out on the grass, a little way along from the pub, crossed my mind, but I was too terrified of rolling over the cliff edge in my sleep. So I started walking. Now there are 2 fairly direct routes from the Traveller's to my home. The safest, and the one I always take, is to simply follow the main road for a couple of miles, and take just one turning off of it. At a sober walking pace, it's around a 30-minute walk, but in my usual evening condition, it can be anything from 40 to 50 minutes. There's also a shortcut, but as with any shortcuts, it comes with a degree of risk. A pretty significant risk, actually, even if one were sober when attempting it. There is an area of coastline between my current location and my home, which would be described as treacherous. It is essentially a quarter mile of rocks and boulders, interspersed with rock pools, rusty shopping trolleys, and even a very old car, which came over the cliff in the 1950s. However, it isn't merely the terrain which makes for difficult traveling. This stretch of coastline is on a curve, meaning that you simply cannot see around to the safety of the next beach until you are almost upon it. In fact, it is more like 2 curves, a soft W shape, if you like. I remember reading the Coast Guard's warning before, which explained that even if you time it right, you only have about 30 minutes to traverse the rocks before the tide cuts you off. Although there are a multitude of warning signs suggesting that it would be unwise to attempt it, 30 minutes is plenty of time to make it across. At least, it's plenty of time if the tide is fully out, and you're sober and agile. On this evening, I was none of those things, and the tide, despite appearing to be out, was actually returning in what seemed to be a hurry. Now, of course, choosing to take this shortcut was a stupid idea, but stupid ideas seem to come to me often when I'm drunk, and drunk is something that I usually am. Having convinced myself the tide was far enough out that I wouldn't have any issues with climbing across boulders in my work shoes, when walking in a straight line was more than a little challenging, and that this was a much quicker route home, I began the descent onto the rocks. I just hoped that I wouldn't have attempted it if the moon wasn't providing such superb luminescence. But with the help of my mobile phone's flashlight app, I could see well enough. I didn't get halfway. The tide had made its way back in, splashing gently against the cliff face in the central part of the soft W. I wasn't happy, and considered swimming, before my brain reminded me that I'd certainly drown. Annoyed at having wasted more time trying to get home, I turned back, hurrying myself over a particularly large boulder and looked ahead for the entry point. I could see the metal bars, which signified the end of the promenade. The moonlight glinting off the metal, then panic gripped me. Between the promenade and my position on the rocks was nothing but seawater. The warnings from all those signs that I had chosen to ignore came to mind, and I began to tremble. I climbed onto a higher rock, looking behind me to see that the tide had risen another meter or so in the last few minutes. I had two choices: try to swim for it, or call the Coast Guard. Even in the state I was in, swimming felt like a stupid idea, beyond even my own level of foolishness. There was no telling how deep the water was, how strong the current would be, and there were all manner of threatening rocks beneath the surface, which could do me damage. It would have to be a call to the Coast Guard, and a prayer that they arrived quickly. I fumbled with my phone, the flashlight pointing at now green and slimy shoes. I pressed the 9 button 3 times. The operative answered, and I turned.
Hello, emergency service operative. Fire, please.
I have a habit of pacing when on the telephone. My brain had not warmed my feet that now was not the time. I took a step, and before I could explain my predicament, my foot slipped from the side of the rock, and everything went black. My phone was long gone when I came to, so I couldn't have told you how long I'd been out, even if the thought had entered my head at the time. What I do remember was the music, soft and rhythmic, as though being played on a harp or perhaps a lyre. The tune was unfamiliar, and I must have been listening to its soothing melody for a few minutes before I even tried to open my eyes. There was another sound in the background, water lapping against stone. That's when it all flooded back to me. The drinks, the rock climbing, the getting cut off by the tide. But where was I? I'd clearly been knocked out from the fall, so I should have drowned, unless the Coast Guard found me in time. I had a vague recollection of calling them, but did I even tell them where I was? The memory was too hazy to be certain. I opened my eyes, half expecting to be in the hospital, and the sounds to be my imagination. But I was not. It was dark, but not the wild darkness of nighttime. There was no mistaking that I was in a cave, but the walls glowed with a turquoise hue, reminding me of an episode of Blue Planet which talks about phosphorescent creatures in the deep ocean. I looked to my left and right, seeing nothing but natural illumination on the cave walls which appeared to stretch as far as I could see in both directions. I closed my eyes, trying to focus my hearing. The music, if that's what it was, came from my right. The sound of water was not coming from my left or right. It was unmistakably coming from above me. The music, eerie as it was, seemed to call to me. I tried to stand, fumbling in the darkness, my hands pressing against the slimy walls for support. It was damp, but not cold. and I ran my hands down my now crumpled shirt and across my rear to discover that I was completely dry. This struck me as odd, but I couldn't quite establish why. I had to choose a direction, and had no clue which way to go. The only noticeable thing was the music. However, music meant people, surely, so it made sense to follow the sound. In the poor lighting, I continued to trip over rocks, splash in shallow pools, and run my hand over unpleasant-feeling surfaces as I made my way. There was no way of telling how far or for how long I had traveled, but it felt as though hours had passed. The music remained as clear as it was when I first came around, but no louder. I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me, or whether I had simply not made it far enough. I looked back for the first time, considering whether I should have gone the other way, but it appeared different, darker than I remembered. Shadows seemed to move against the walls of what now was unmistakably a lengthy network of tunnels. I shivered, not through cold, but a hint of fear gripped me. Of course, I was already afraid. Being lost and potentially trapped in the dark is rather terrifying, but this was something different. Something sinister. Heading back felt dangerous, so I kept going, speeding up as well as I could on such terrain. I refused to turn around, certain that I could detect shadows moving into the far reaches of my eyesight, just when I thought that the tunnel had no end. The distance between the walls began to widen, weakening the reach of the phosphorescent light, and forcing me to choose a side. The music appeared to come from both directions, so I kept to the right, without much thought, as my hand continued to slide across the surface, following the wall as it sloped further away from its counterpart. The music finally grew louder. I paused, the beating of my heart audible above the stringed instrument, and chanced to look around. I could make out the light from the wall I had left behind, snaking its way in a circular formation, finishing at the point at which I stood. I may have awoken in a tunnel, but I was most certainly in a cave now. I could just about make out the entrance to the cave which I had passed through, and a different kind of light near to it. I stared, trying to focus my eyes, certain that I'd not missed a red light on my way through. It was small, and I wondered if it was light from a phone or other electronic device. I strained my eyes, debating whether or not to head towards it, when I realized there was more than one red light. 6, in fact, and moving in pairs. Not just moving, but moving in my direction, shrouded in jet black shadow. I had to run. My fight or flight reflex told me as much, but the practicality of gaining any speed in a dark and treacherous cave meant I was unsuccessful. I felt cold as they approached, my hair standing on end, my pupils dilating as I saw my demise approach. And then, nothing. There did not appear to be any time between that encounter and me suddenly standing on a candle-lit circular stone floor. It was as if I had simply been transported from one location to another. But I suppose I had been heading in this direction anyway. I studied my surroundings, trying to understand my situation a little better, but to no avail. I was still in the cave, but the turquoise light I had followed so faithfully now appeared perhaps 40 or 50 feet above me. I was stood on a circle of stone, some 30 feet in diameter, but it was not a natural feature of the location. The stone was carved with intricate designs, none of which were familiar to me, although something about them made me uneasy. I wouldn't have known with any certainty if they were occult symbols, but this was the first thought that came to mind. In the very center of the stone circle stood a robed figure, playing on an ancient version of a harp. I could not make out their appearance, as the robe ran from head to foot, the hood largely obscuring their face. Even so, it was evident from the hands alone that the musician was female, with young-looking skin. I glanced around once more, nervous about the return of those shadows, but saw none. I continued to stand there, not wanting to interrupt the music. Something about the situation made me certain that I should wait to be spoken to. When she showed no sign of stopping playing, I had no choice but to speak.
Where am I?
I asked. The music stopped abruptly.
You are here.
Came the soft voice.
Where is here?
I replied, a little irritated by the stupid answer I'd been given.
Home. Your home?
I wondered, doubtful that anyone could actually live in a cave, no matter how mad they were.
Our home. Enough of the cryptic bullshit!
I told her, my angry words seeming much louder than I had intended as they echoed from the damp walls of the cave. I thought I detected a sigh leave her mouth. Slowly, she placed the instrument on the ground and lifted the hood from her head. I was taken aback by how beautiful she was. She then proceeded to remove the fastenings beneath her chain, slipping the robe from her shoulders and allowing it to drop to the floor. I struggled to keep my mouth closed as I took in her full nudity.
What's going on?
I asked, a little bashfully.
Who are you?
She took a step towards me.
I'm the mother,
she said, her green eyes twinkling with something mischievous. Her red lips parted a little as she cocked her head to the side, almost playfully.
Whose mother?
I was unsure if I wanted to know the answer to this. She ignored the question.
My children saved you.
I tried to remember what had happened, but could recall nothing after slipping from the boulder I'd been standing on.
And where are your children now?
I asked nervously, trying to politely look at her face when speaking to her.
They are around, playing somewhere, no doubt. I need to get home,
I told her, as nice as it was to speak to a beautiful, naked woman, something I had not had the pleasure of for some time. The situation was too bizarre, and unless it was all a dream, I knew it couldn't end well.
Up top?
She asked, a glint of anger flashing across her face. I didn't understand at first, but quickly realized that we had to be beneath ground level.
Yes, how do I get back there? I don't remember how I came into this place.
She appeared to be thinking about my question.
My children can take you back, if that's what you really want.
I looked at her, unsure of how to word my next statement.
Well, I can't very well just disappear and live in this cave with you,
I stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, which I suppose it was. She looked displeased with my words.
Very well. Just know that they will only take you back to where they found you. The tide is high, and you will be returned to that very place. I just hope that you are an exceptionally strong swimmer. Children!
The woman shouted for her children, smiling as 3 pairs of red eyes seemed to float towards me, impossibly black shadows surrounding them. I stepped back, afraid of what they would do.
If you change your mind,
she said, her smile returning.
Just call out for me. However, if you do come back, I would have to insist that you stay.
Before I could answer, I was gone from that room, suddenly ice cold and unable to breathe. As promised, I'd been returned to the exact spot that I'd landed from my fall. Now a good 4 meters below sea level, the tide pulled me back and forth, far stronger than I could fight against. The salt water burned my eyes, so I scrunched them shut and tried to swim in the direction I believed to be up. I did not have the strength, and pure terror overwhelmed me. My chest felt as if it would explode as I tried to hold my breath. Eventually, I could hold it no longer and took in a lungful of seawater. It is a natural impulse to want to survive, and I wasn't in a position to weigh up my options. I knew that I was close to death, and clinging to some illogical hope that it would work, I called out. She had only referred to herself as the mother, so that was the word I used. With a lungful of water and on the verge of unconsciousness, I could make no sound, but my thought was heard somewhere in that underground room. A fraction of a second later, I was spluttering up seawater across the stone circle that I had found myself lying upon.
I'm glad you returned,
she said with a smile.
I didn't have a lot of choice,
I retorted.
and I don't intend to stay. I made your options clear to you,
she warned.
Now, you are wet through. Put this on.
She handed me a gown, identical to her own, which she must have fetched knowing that I would return in this state. Reluctantly, I removed my clothes and slipped it on. She looked at me approvingly.
Now, you are ready.
She turned on her heel, walking to the far side of the circle, standing above a carving of what looked like a doorway, with horned creatures around it. She closed her eyes and mumbled something indiscernible. I watched in surprise as the ground opened to reveal crude steps descending further into the earth. I followed, certain I had no option, and knowing there was no way out from where I stood. Flaming torches adorned the walls of a narrow tunnel, and I kept a few paces behind, still shivering from the cold water, trying to avert my gaze from her naked rear. The tunnel began to twist and turn, heading off in different directions, until I had no idea which way would lead back. And then we were at what I assumed was our destination. It took me a few moments to understand what was happening. The candles were no surprise, but there were at least 20 other people sitting in the room, all of whom looked too old to still be breathing. I noticed that they all wore the same black robes except one. A single, red-robed person was seated at the front. They sat in rows, with a walkway between them, facing the far end of the cavern. At the end of the walkway was an altar of some kind, an undoubtedly satanic image etched into the sandstone above. My first thought that I would become a sacrifice, that some devil-worshipping cult would cut me to pieces and bathe in my blood. No one looked around as we entered, and she whispered to me to remove my robe. I didn't want to, but was significantly outnumbered if this went badly, whatever this was. She took my hand, and we walked towards the altar. Naked as the day we were born, as we stood before it, the red robe approached us, a decorative cushion in her hands. The hands were old, wrinkled, and twisted with arthritis. On the cushion sat 2 rings, and the gravity of the situation hit me just as hard as the icy water had done not long ago. I was about to be married. We stood in traditional wedding fashion facing one another. She leaned in and whispered in my ear,
You have to go along with it, or they will kill you.
I nodded, not doubting that she was telling the truth.
But why me?
I asked, before the ceremony could begin.
You were available. We saved you, and now you need to save us.
I had no time to ask any more questions, as the red-robed official began mumbling in an unknown language. I looked around the crowd to see everyone staring at us in silence. But the thing that struck me was that all the spectators were female, not a man in sight. It all felt too solemn for me to interrupt, as crazy as that sounds. I couldn't take in what was happening and stood in silence, as though I were numb. Before I knew it, rings were placed on our fingers, and we were ushered through a small doorway into a tiny room containing only a bed.
I need to know what the hell is going on,
I said, once we were alone. I tried to keep my tone forceful, but not angry. My words came out feeble and frightened.
I am the mother, the chosen one. Until my children grow, I am the youngest and the only fertile member of our kind.
Your kind? I repeated. The suggestion that these were not humans sounded ridiculous at first, but I'd been transported from one location to another in the blink of an eye, and those shadow creatures were certainly not of this world.
We have survived for centuries, finding mates. As and when our numbers dwindled, we have gone by many names over the years before now. Sailors called us sirens, telling tales of how our singing would cause them to crash their ships. This was never the case. We helped people who were in danger. We just asked for something in return.
A husband? That's insane!
Again, her eyes registered something akin to anger.
Usually just a mate, to continue our line. I wanted more.
So what? We're supposed to live happily ever after in a cave full of old women and just make babies?
As soon as I'd said it, it didn't sound quite as bad as I'd thought.
And what were those shadow things? You called them your children, but they were something else.
Just lie down.
My brain told me that I didn't want to, but other parts of my body suggested otherwise. She touched me, gently guiding me onto the bed. I told myself to just go with it, and then work out how to escape after, still clinging to the hope that this was simply a dream, as she had her way with me, and not entirely against my will. She began mumbling in the same old language I had heard before. Her breath quickened. Her face became flushed with red. I could feel myself reaching the end, and with her weight on top of me, knew there was no way to stop this from happening. As I climaxed inside her, she smiled, rubbing her belly.
Those things, as you called them, are my children. The children of the deep. They're simply in our true form.
The words seemed to take an eternity to be deciphered by my brain. But when they were, I knew I was finished. I must have looked frightened or confused, most likely both. And she seized the moment to demonstrate what she meant. With a rush of air, her eyes went from that crystal green to deep red. Her flesh transformed from pale white to a jet black shadow, and she hovered above me. No other facial features were distinguishable on her, but my expression must have shown it all. That and the rapid release of my bladder. I attempted to roll from the bed, hoping my legs would hold out long enough for me to get away from whatever demon this was. I got as far as opening the door, only to be greeted by the red-robed one. I tried to shove her out of my way, but my actions triggered a terrifying scream from all 20 or so creatures. The room was now filled with shadows of otherworldly darkness, red eyes all directed at me. They were upon me in seconds, the shadows pulling at my flesh until it tore away in strips. There were so many of them that I couldn't see what was happening, but every part of my body felt on fire, and I was beginning to lose consciousness. I heard a voice, her voice, and they backed away. I looked down at my torso, my insides now hanging out in a bloody heap. I could taste blood in my mouth and struggled to breathe. She put on her previous appearance, possibly to comfort me, as she knelt by my head, stroking my hair. She looked sad, disappointed perhaps, and for a fleeting moment, I felt guilty, as if I had let her down, as if this was all my fault.